Hey Zendaya, imagine you're in the ER with Tom Holland and the doctor says something like he has a gastroenteritis with inflammation. Sounds confusing, right? Good news. Medical terms aren't random. Instead, they're like puzzles. Once you learn the pieces, you can figure out almost any word. Let's break it down. To begin, we can talk about the root, which tells you what body part or system is involved. It's also considered the core meaning. For example, we have cardi, which means heart, derm, which means skin, and gastro, which means stomach. Now, we can move on to combining form. The combining form makes terms easier to say and connect. It is usually a root plus a vowel, and the vowel is usually an O, such as cardio, neuro, and osteo. The O is like the glue holding parts together. Now we can move on to prefixes. Prefixes come before the word, at the very beginning. They give extra info like location, time, and number. The prefix itself is a prefix. That means before, meaning before the word. Examples include hyper, which means above average, hypo, which means below average, and Brady, which means slower than average. Now we can move on to suffixes, which come at the end of these words. These tell what's happening, which could be the condition, procedure, or disease. Examples include itis, such as arthritis, which is inflammation, ology, which is the study of, such as biology, ectomy, which means removal, such as appendectomy. Even prefixes such as, or suffixes as al, ary, and ac are also suffixes that all mean pertaining to. Now this brings us on over to our next theme, which is how do we build these words? Rule 1 is that we are going to use a combining vowel, which is usually O, when joining two words, such as gastro and entero plus itis, which is gastroenteritis. However, notice how we drop this O here but not here. That will bring us on over to our second rule, which is dropping the O. We drop the O when the suffix starts with a vowel, such as neuro plus itis is neuritis, not neurotitis. That doesn't make sense. So we drop the O when the suffix starts with a vowel. Now on the other hand, we keep the O when the suffix starts with a consonant, such as cardio plus logy, which is cardiology, not cardiology, cardiology. Now that we know how to build these words, how do we break the words down so we can understand them better? We can start with identifying the suffix, and then the prefix, and then ending in the root word. Let's do a few examples. To start, let's do hypoglycemia. We can break this word down into hypo, glyc, and emia. Hypo meaning below, glyc meaning sugar, as in glycolysis or glucose, and emia, which means a blood condition, like leukemia, which is blood cancer. If you put these words together, you get low blood sugar. This makes sense, right? Let's do another one. You've likely heard of this disease, called arthritis. We can break it down into arthro and itis. Arthro meaning joints, and itis meaning inflammation. Arthritis is characterized by joint inflammation. Now we can do a more interesting one, cardiomegaly. We can break this into cardio and megaly. Cardio meaning heart and megaly meaning enlargement. Cardiomegaly is characterized by an enlarged heart. Now that we've covered the basics, we can go over some of the nitty-gritty stuff, such as confusing suffixes. We can start with itis versus osis. Itis is inflammation and osis is condition. Itis could be considered also tonsillitis, which is inflammation of the tonsils, and osis could be characterized with osteoporosis, which is a chronic bone disease. Another good example of confusing suffixes is logy versus logist. Logy is the study of, while logist is one who studies. An example of logy would be biology, which is the study of life, and an example of logist is biologist, which is one who studies life, and specifically one who studies biology. For my last example of confusing suffixes that I personally struggle with would be ectomy versus otomy. Ectomy means removal, complete removal of an organ, and otomy means cutting into. The way I remember this is a hysterectomy is a complete removal of the uterus versus a hysterotomy is only an incision. To wrap everything up, we'll be talking about some important suffixes. We can begin with gram, graph, and graphy. A gram is a recording, a graph is an instrument, and the graphy is the process. A good example of this is an electrocardiography, which is a process, science, and technique of recording the heart's electrical activity using electrodes. An electrocardiograph is the instrument to perform the electrocardiography, and the electrocardiogram is the actual printed recording of the heart's electrical waves. And then we can go right on over to scope versus scopy. Scope is a tool, and scopy is a process. An endoscope is the physical instrument to perform the endoscopy. And then we can wrap it on up with tomy, ectomy, and stomy. Tomy being cutting, ectomy meaning removal, and stomy meaning opening. I talked about this in the previous example of confusing suffixes, but we'll come back to it, for it is quite important. An example of tomy is a tracheotomy, which is just a cutting of the trachea. Ectomy. An example of ectomy is an appendectomy, which is a complete removal of the appendix. Stomy. An example of stomy is a colostomy, which is an opening of the colon. See, Zendaya, medical terms are not impossible. They're just puzzles. Once you know the pieces, you can figure out almost anything the doctors say. So next time someone explains Tom Holland's injuries, Lord knows he'll have a lot because he does his own stunts, you'll actually understand it.